Welcome to the Funnel Reboot Podcast with your host, Glenn Schmeltzley. Let's get into today's show.
Hey, Glenn here. Welcome to Funnel Reboot. Let's get straight into today's episode where we're going to talk about the various impacts that your content has across different media channels. Did you know that how your message is received is mainly dependent on where people received it? This is a fact of life in an era that's framed by paid, earned, shared, and owned channels, best known for its acronym, the PESO framework. Focusing in on what we want our brand to be known for, marketers are soon hit with the reality that the same content plays differently when it's issued in a corporate release versus an influencer's social post versus a customer's review versus a direct message that's sent from someone we know. We have limited control in many of these settings, and because of the sway gigantic Silicon Valley companies have, even the media channels that let us publish our content aren't giving us enough control to say that we really own these properties. So how do we tune our content for these channels so each one has the greatest impact on our audience? Our guest says that only after we accept the degrees of control afforded to us by the different channels can we align our content with what each of them does best. This concept is called owned asset optimization. Our guest began working at Terakeet, a central New York marketing agency, in 2014, and he's now the director of marketing there. Prior to that, he worked in new media and web strategy with the fabled Syracuse University football program, running both their social media and their official team site. He has a bachelor's degree from SUNY Cortland, and he received his master's degree in instructional design and development from Syracuse University. He's also a fiction and a nonfiction author, and, together with his wife, tries corralling their 3 children, mostly unsuccessfully. Let's talk about owned assets with RJ Licata.
RJ Licata, welcome to Funnel Reboot.
Hi, Glenn. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, glad to have you. So what we're going to be talking about today is an approach that people should be taking when it comes to how they're using the content that they have. And so just as backdrop here, I know that we've had it drilled into us as marketers that we need to be writing for search engines. We've been told that we have to, look out for quality, and it's really important to get high on search rankings. But that can't be the only value. I mean, we've got to remember also that there are people that are trying to make a buying decision, and instead of having a face-to-face meeting like B2B or walking into a retail establishment, people are using devices and it's all happening on the internet. So we have to think about where their heads are at. We have to think about how they want to buy, how they perceive us versus our competitors. So head us in the right direction here. Are we squandering what we really should be doing when we think about the content that is representing our brands?
Yes. What I think has ended up happening is if the marketing fundamentals get lost in shiny objects, new tools, new approaches, AI, fancy algorithms, and you hit it right on the head, connecting with the people is what's most important for brands to be successful with their marketing. And you can satisfy Google and also satisfy consumers. But a large part of that is because Google's algorithm is improving and becoming more sophisticated so that they're serving up what they know the people want. And brands who excel in organic search are creating content where the Google algorithm is going, right? Like that whole Wayne Gretzky skate where the puck is going.
Yep.
They're creating for people because that's where Google is currently and where it's headed even more so. Where it gets even bigger and broader, though, I think is understanding the evolution of marketing and how 100 years ago there was you know radio ads and the soap operas and the Procter and Gambles that were selling detergent to housewives through their radio programs and eventually through the first initial TV programs, and that created a mechanism where brands had access to people, but they were restricted to 3 channels, and that was the only form of intake that people had, right? So they were kind of like a captive audience, and that extended through the Mad Men era when
Yep.
all of the advertising really exploded. And what ended up happening was when cable TV came out, people had more options, people had more choices, and all of the advertising and commercials became more of an interruption for people. And Seth Godin hit this on the head in the late 90s when he introduced the idea of permission marketing, which is the alternate. Yeah, there it is right there. I've got it somewhere here too. He wrote a book on it, on permission marketing, where he said the interruption model was good when people didn't have choices. Now, when people have choices, you have to give them you have to allow them to opt in. And that really was a huge commercial for email marketing, because at the time that was the best way to execute permission marketing. But Glenn, how many emails do you get from brands where you signed up for 10% off and now you continue to get those emails from the brand month after month, week after week? Your inbox is probably full, right?
Yeah. And it's not the only place that I'm looking for messages.
Right. And you start to your eyes glaze over and you start to ignore it because it's just repetitive, right? And you don't open them after a while. And so what ended up happening was permission marketing became another form of interruption marketing. If I go to my email, I'm looking for things that I'm looking for, not necessarily the 30th email from a brand that I signed up for 2 years ago. So what has started to happen in conjunction with that is about 10 years or so after Seth Godin comes out with permission marketing, you have a couple of things that economically changed the situation for marketers. And that was the mass release and adoption of the smartphone. So iPhones become in every pocket. People have information accessible to them all the time. At any given moment, they can pull out their phone, do price comparisons, research, whatever. And the second thing that happened was Netflix and streaming content, because now people can watch content on demand anytime they want, and there's less opportunity for the interruption model. People have less patience and less resilience to those messages. And so those two things kind of cut interruption marketing down to the point where it's not the most efficient method of connecting with consumers. And what I and my team have come up with is this idea of reception marketing, which is the next evolution of permission marketing, which basically lives and breathes on the idea that consumers are out there. They hold all the power. It's an era of consumer empowerment. And instead of trying to force feed them your messaging, instead meet them where they are, figure out what they need, serve them, and serve them in a way where it's consumer service rather than customer service. We want to be on the front end of providing value to these brands so that they begin to build a relationship with my brand, our brand, so that when it comes time to buy, because most people aren't always in buying mode, especially for high consideration products, when it becomes time to buy, you're the first one they think of because you've been there all along throughout the whole process.
Yeah. Tall order. Right.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
I think you and I live in the world of, we believe it's possible, but it is tough. And, a few things that you've said there that I just want to circle back to that display how tough it can be is that with so many channel choices out there for consumers, for the brand to be able to speak with authority and with the right message at the right time for them in their journey, there's a lot of anticipating that has to happen there.
Mm-hmm.
But another thing about it is that we have to have a better way of looking at this. If I think of how, I've been in marketing departments and also helped marketing departments from a brand side, from an agency side. The language is probably flawed, where we're already putting blinders on. We're saying, well, what is our TikTok strategy, or what is our email strategy, or what is our, and we're falling into those buckets where, let's face it, they're not all the same. Some of them are inbound channels, some of them are sort of outbound channels, some of them are meant only at top of funnel, some of them are deeper into consideration and action. So basically, if we get suckered into that, I'm looking at the channels and, rushing about trying to put the right content in the right place. I'm getting the cart before the horse. It's not the channels that I have to be thinking about with my brand. It's my brand itself that I have to be thinking of. And I have to start from the brand and then take that strategy out into the execution. And so I know that you favor this idea of owned asset branding, where I'm putting time and effort, money into how my own brand will meet customers. And I'm focused purely on that without regard at that moment to the different channels. I'm starting here with, what do I stand for? What's my value prop? How do I help my ideal customer? Right?
Yes. So you're exactly right. I would take that even one step further and say that before owned asset optimization is about the asset before the channel, right? So it's asset focused, channel agnostic. It can work with any mix of channels depending on how to get that asset in front of the right people at the right time. The step that I would take even further, though, is to not start with the brand, but start with the customer. What does your customer want or need? When you understand their behavior, their desires, their problems, then it makes it easier to craft the right assets to solve their problems and to provide them with information. And then once you do that, you can tweak an idea for a tweet or for a YouTube video or for whatever channel you want, but it starts fundamentally with what do the consumers need, and how does your brand solve that particular problem or challenge in a unique way. And that's where it starts to meld into something that's really special.
When you've got that, and yes, that's a great thing. You can do an inventory against the different content that you have. And you guys have come up with a particularly smart way of arranging the different types of assets that you have. And you got 3 particular ones that you break the world into. I know that the first one is owned, right? That's the topic of the day. So tell us what owned assets are to you. What is that grouping within the entire inventory of all the assets that we have across all channels?
Sure. So the inventory can be spread out, like you said, across the channels, and there's 3 main buckets, and the buckets are separated by the amount of control that the brands have over the deployment and the build of those assets. So for example, in the owned bucket, we have that broken out into 3 tiers. The bottom tier is the foundation, and that is a brand foundation. You were talking about, what does our brand stand for? There's other sections, customer personas, market positioning, how you want to separate yourself from competitors and differentiate. All of those factors go into maybe what would be considered in many cases, but not all cases, like the below the surface iceberg type materials, right? That don't always poke through, but they influence how things are built out further on down the brand road.
They're the touchstone that you always should be going to before you hit publish on another piece of content.
Right. And when something feels off brand for a brand that you're really familiar with, if somebody comes out with something that you're like, that doesn't sound like them, it's because they've gone against what you interpret those foundational elements to be. Right. So that feeds everything else that the brand does. And those pieces are influenced strongly by the market, which essentially is your customer or your consumer that you're targeting. And so you want to, you don't want to sell a product that won't appeal to the people who you want to buy it. So you have to kind of merge all of that into your foundational brand. And then you elevate into the ground level, the second tier there within the own section, which is basically your website. And it could be one website for some of the brands that are larger and have multiple domains. It could be many websites, but that's your core root transactional point. It's the primary owned element, because you can control everything that goes on there, how it comes across, what it looks like, who it resonates with. That's, your baby, your full control. And ultimately with digital marketing, everything you do, you want to draw back towards that home base, because again, that's where people send inquiries, contact forms, buy products, whatever it is. That's where they're making, their almost final, if not final, decision about working with your brand. And then the level above that within this own section again is things that more or less live on the website, but have a little bit of a further extension from that core domain. So blog posts, some of the pillar content that maybe aren't, key domain pages, but are infrastructurally important and sound to relaying your message on your website. Tools and downloads, corporate comms, all of those things that are brand reflective, but you have still full control over, would sit in that tier one box.
Yeah. And I'm hearing that all the things that you're doing for that owned content are additive to what we were saying earlier about organic, right? So if you consider those inside of this owned bucket and you make sure that there's integrity between them, right? They fit together. Yep. Then yes, we are saying that the search engines, as well as the GPT versions of them that are following, are smart enough to understand that they are consistent and that for the particular customer who needs that information right now, that they will go ahead and get them to it.
Yes. And you mentioned GPT, which I think, is something that is only going to increase in importance when it comes to maintaining the integrity of your owned assets. When you start searching for, how would Nike execute something like this on ChatGPT, you're going to get a language model that's influenced by Nike's owned assets, or not, depending on whether they're there or not. So if Nike's not managing that brand narrative through their owned assets, they're leaving it up to somebody else.
Yeah, that void's going to get filled
together. Right. So there's a lot of you push the water away and it just comes back and fills in, and whether it's the water you want or not, it's going to be filled, like you said, with the void. So there's critical brand strength and protection elements that are inherent to a strong owned asset packaging.
Yeah. So, and I guess to finish on this one, if we think about what else we can do with the website, this can extend to perhaps paid search ads. This can extend to, like we're doing right now, a podcast where the actual the downloads are sitting on the website itself. What I'm saying is that as long as these things are ways that hitting that publish button either is on that site or can get back to that website, and more importantly, you could even revise them after they've been published. Like that is the true definition of them being owned. Right. And this is, I'm going to wrestle this point for just a moment because I want people to grasp it fully before we move on to the other types of assets that sound very similar, but this is a key difference.
Yes, because you have full control over it, and you can. And so we describe it as full creative and technical control. You can decide what goes on there. You can decide how it looks. And you also, and I think this is something that we don't often talk about enough, but that is inherent with this, is you have protections on who else can talk about you. So on a third party website, you can get, on Amazon, you can get negative reviews. On your own website, you have more control over that. So you don't run the risk of people finding information that you don't want put out there on your owned domain and other assets.
Yes. Or you have a private community that's linked to your domain,
Yes.
and
Yep.
somebody spouts off in that community, and through moderating,
Yeah.
that's either, that conflict is resolved, or, there are measures taken that you as a brand are taking your responsibility, your full responsibility over that. And just my take, I think consumers are going to notice that. I think if, or maybe I'll put it on the flip side. If a consumer sees that something is happening directly related to a brand's control, and that brand doesn't do something about it, I think a consumer is can take that into account when they think, should I buy from these people or not? They could be doing something here. They could be stepping up, and they're not, or they're letting their content get stale. This isn't current. These guys could be doing something about this, right? There's an onus.
Yes. I mean, I think the word ownership can maybe be used both ways, right? Like there's a certain degree
like
of
owning our pets, or our property.
Yeah, right. The responsibility that is granted to you. And it's something that you can grow or squander. If you've built a following, I've gotten into this like with friends before who wonder why, say, certain celebrities speak out about politics.
Yep.
And my argument is like, listen, they've built, like, their word should not be taken any more strongly than anyone else's, except they've built a followership of trust that allows them to get it out to more people. Now that trust can erode if they misuse it. And so that's the responsibility of it. And I think it translates to brands as well. It's like, how do you manage that responsibility that people have granted to you, and that trust that they've given you? And if you squander it and misuse it, it goes away. And it's a real thing that can happen to you. So there's a certain sense of like, let's be really responsible with how we manage this attention that we've been granted.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love you pulling from those other examples. You must be a real gas at a party. So we have two other buckets that we're going to get into of asset types. But before we do that, we're going to take a really quick break.
Do you have a lot of company data in reach, but struggle to get useful business insights out of it? Do you open up your Google Analytics but find you're at a loss on how to get it reporting the way you want? Do you wonder what new marketing strategies you could leverage if you could just unlock what's in your data? If you said yes, then you sound just like other clients did when they started working with me. Many B2B companies who I've done project work with have been helped by modernizing their analytics. Some deploy dashboards, some activate their data using machine learning in their campaigns. As of this recording in fall of 2023, my schedule's opened up enough to accommodate 1 or 2 projects. Should you be ready to begin a project, let's talk about what you would like your analytics to do for you. Please reach out today via the podcast feedback channels, or connect with me, Hey Glenn S, 2 N's on Glenn, on either Twitter or Instagram. Or search up Marketing Analytics People on LinkedIn. I'm usually the first Glenn that pops up. Okay, let's get back to the show.
RJ, the next one that we want to get to is managed assets. And we're going to move into a couple of different channels here. If you could describe what they have in common, what would that be?
So the key piece of all of this infrastructure and framework, I think, is the interrelationship between each of the categories, buckets, whatever you want to call them. So owned and then managed have a certain play against them, where owned is our marketing assets and channels that the brand has full creative and technical control over. Managed are areas where they have some control, but they're at the mercy of another. Right. And we break it out into 2 tiers within the managed bucket, because there's slight separation between the degree of control that a brand would have within that managed bucket. So for example,
yeah,
if if we look at like the lowest tier of managed assets, and by lowest I mean they're the closest to the owned bucket. So they're one step outside of full control, but they're still somewhat controllable. Those would be things like social media, email, paid advertising, like cost per click.
Yep.
They're not fully owned because you're relying on someone else, whether social media, you're dependent on Facebook, emails, your email distribution software product is their ability to deliver, their deliverability or spam filtering or whatever can impact your ability to get your message across. But there are owned elements to those things. The content that goes on there you own because you've created it, you have full control over what it says, but how many people it gets to through the social algorithm is up to Mark and Elon, right? And then you can say that about other things too, like advertising, and how like Google cost per click, it has certain restrictions, and you can't put photos in Google search ads yet. They're inline and they look like search results, and that's a restriction that the platform has. But the content itself and what you want it to say is your call.
Yeah, within their policies and advertiser guidelines. So,
correct.
Like you said, they can kind of they have the ability to unpublish or de-rank. It's freedom of speech, not freedom of reach.
Yep.
So take us into that higher tier. That's things that now they're still managed, but we have even less control.
Right. So if you think about something like, say, Wikipedia, right, where brands can get in there and influence, and I shouldn't say influence because that steps into the next level a bit, but they have some control. They can within certain guidelines, and if they raise their hand and say, I am whatever Wikipedia's terminology is, an approved editor or whatever, and they're clear and open about what their intentions are, they can influence the narrative, assuming that it's true, right? And they have that ability to participate in that. But Wikipedia also has the ability for others to chime in there. So it's not only open the way a social media, like, you can post on your social media feed. I can't. So there's certain blockers up there that put you more in control of your own social media feed than, say, Wikipedia, where it's open to anyone who wants to come in with.
Yeah, I'm just one other person contributing. Yeah,
totally. And so like organic search is another channel where you can influence and support your ability to rank, and you can control your knowledge panel, and you can do other things that allow you to maintain a certain degree of presence and control on organic search, but you're also at the mercy more so through that channel of other outside influence than you might be with something like social.
So I'm going to bring this up for a quick second. We've got, we've come from the completely owned properties. That was wonderful, especially for control freaks. Mm-hmm. And as we move into this tier that you've just described, or the bucket of all those managed channels, I'm imagining some people are breaking out in hives with the thought that their brand can get tarnished or minimalized by these different arenas they're in. And I know that some of them might want to say, well, then I'm just going to take my marbles and go home. I only want to stick with the things that I can directly sink my hooks into. Mm-hmm. What do you say to those people? Are they able to still be a brand with authority if they don't play in these arenas in 2023?
No, because I think you had mentioned the void gets filled by someone else. And so if you're not owning your story, someone else is going to tell it for you. And the further away from owned that you get, we've kind of interpreted that as the more reach you can get, but also the less control you have. So as control goes down, reach goes up, right? You think about the news. Yep. They can talk about you and it's going to get put in a bunch of households, but you have really no control over what
they say.
Yep. Unless, and this is the key, unless you've built out such strength with your owned assets that the story is influenced by what they're interpreting, which is a strong owned presence. Your
Yeah, you have the high
reputation.
ground there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
if your reputation is solid, when they're doing research for a news broadcast, they're going to draw from that.
Yeah.
And so that's how you influence, that top tier.
And just to pause for a quick second, because I think you nailed a sin that is committed inside of marketing departments, or maybe by the people above them who aren't marketers, who set their KPIs. If something like reach is selected by just what you said there, we're going to be in deep trouble, because if a marketing group is tasked with, well, get all the reach that you can, then they're going to go to these managed and even the higher bucket beyond that, where there's, a ton of reach. However, it's going to come and bite them, because they won't have a foundation underneath that. They'll have it sitting out on these rented areas where the owners of those rented areas can decide at any time to kick the sharecroppers off the land.
Yes. So my favorite example, my team, if they listen to this, will roll their eyes because I use it often and it's kind of a running joke. But my favorite example of the missed opportunity is, if you remember, probably 5 years ago or so, Planters ran a Super Bowl ad where they killed off Mr. Peanut, and there was the birth of Baby Nut. And so you pay $5 million to get in front of however many million people watch the Super Bowl. Now, what's interesting is, going back to what we were talking about with interruption marketing, the Super Bowl is actually one situation where television commercials are less interruption and are more permission/reception marketing, because people are tuning in specifically wanting those stories and those commercials, right?
Yeah. It's very odd. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a little bit beside the point there, but it's an interesting 1-2 punch. But so they kill off Mr. Peanut, and they have, Baby Nut there. And I don't remember exactly what the commercial ended with, but if you were to search Baby Nut, then there was no owned property or owned asset for Baby Nut or anything related to that by Planters. So you have all of these eyeballs, all of this attention, and there was no way to follow up and learn more, or interact with the brand beyond that one commercial. And so it was like a 30-second, really hot, really bright rocket that was gone when it was done. And so it's, these other channels and assets should not be ignored, because they do provide value, but it's about making sure, like you said, that there's the infrastructure and the foundation of owned assets to catch people when they're looking for more information from your brand beyond that high impact.
And what you're saying is, when you've got that measurement structure in place, what you ought to see is, sure, you'll have these things that can get your reach way up, but then you should see possibly it taking a little bit of time, but the lower funnel metrics.
Yes.
The listens to your podcast, the views of key web pages, the filling out of certain forms or other engagement activities on your site, and then even deeper conversations happening. These should be like following a leaf as it goes down a river.
Yes. Yeah. And one of the mistakes that I think many marketers make is that they focus, and there's reason for it. There's economic pressures on them to focus on the transactional. But, again, another example I like to use that will get some groans from my team. But if you remember the movie Apollo 13, the astronauts are stuck in the capsule and they're headed back towards Earth, trying to get back. And there's a news broadcast, because by now, remember, nobody wanted to talk about their mission.
Yeah, they were getting tired of it.
Right. But now it's top line news. And so you've got these two newscasters, and they're trying to help the viewer understand how dire the situation is. And they have a basketball and a softball. And they say, if these two balls were 14 feet apart, the astronauts would have to hit a plane no thicker than this piece of paper. So you understand, like, it's pretty dramatic. Reception marketing is the answer to that dilemma, where marketers are, the customer is the spaceship, and the marketers are trying to place this piece of paper right at the spot so that they enter at the right place and fall into transaction. And instead, reception marketing is saying, what are these people looking for? What do they need? What is the frequency that they're vibrating on, right? That's the reception idea, is like, what are they most likely to receive? And what signals are they putting out that they're interested in? When you create content that satisfies them before they're coming in horizontally at this piece of paper and are thinking about it coming in more vertically, get them into your we don't like the word funnel because the customer journey is so all over the place, but to simplify it, get them in your environment, your marketing ecosystem way earlier in the process. So it's a no-brainer that they're going to fall in. Now that piece of paper is, 50 stacks of paper rather than one single sheet of paper, because you've gotten them in much sooner and they're more apt to purchase from you.
Yes. Or maybe you've been, okay, I'm going to bastardize the example, but maybe you've been giving them feedback to help their thinking, maybe thought leadership pieces that when they were a ways out, you were helping them make little course corrections where you're helping them think about their problem better and understand the way that your brand has the right solution for it. And it just increases, by an order of magnitude, their chances of getting in at that paper thin trajectory, right? They've already been heading towards it. It's not like they were zooming along and now you got to hit the brakes and crank the wheel. They've been kind of moving towards this for some time and you've guided them in.
Yeah. And ethical marketing is really just about mindful and customer first manipulation, right? It's about convincing them that your product and your solution is the answer, but it's doing so in a way that's providing them with value all the way through. So we're not talking about, a bait and switch or anything like that. We're talking about these little nuanced pieces of information that are guiding them towards what you want, which is ultimately a transaction. But when you come in transaction first, they run the risk of, to go back to the Apollo 13 analogy, bouncing off. They come in at the wrong angle, they bounce off, and they're buying from somebody else. And the timing that is required when they're in market for such a short period of time, that the timing that's required and the perfect timing that's needed to get them to buy from you, when you look at it that way, is too much to rely on if you're really looking at efficiencies in marketing spend and growing your base at a reasonable customer acquisition cost, which is really what it all comes down to.
Yeah. And I mean, what we're falling prey to here in some of those cases, like you alluded to, is that a single person who's got a KPI over them, like raw lead, they are juicing things to make their own metric look good, which is why I really appreciate how in the Mach 6 outline, and we're going to have it in the show notes, company values is one of the very bottom ones. So if your company values, if it says we're customer first, something that you can find in every company's, mantra. Well, this is where that comes down to roost. This is where you say, okay, no, that individual rogue player, they don't get to do that because that's not good for the customer. So we're going to do what's necessary. We're going to reframe our measurement and our incentive architecture. We're going to upend all sorts of things, or we're going to connect other systems so that we can see that a single action doesn't have any weight unless it causes a corresponding action at the next stage. Yes. It's those kind of things that you got to think through. And when you do, then like you said, then your real cost of acquisition and your predictability of getting that new customer, then it's optimized, but not until you've done the work.
Yeah. And there's, it makes it a little bit more of a longer play. But when you look at things like retention and customer satisfaction and
customer lifetime value,
yes, they all are influenced by the strength of that. And I think, like, I like that you mentioned about the values. If it's not just something that you're checking a box and saying we need to come up with our company values, and one of them is customer comes first. But if you do truly believe it, not only is it good for the customer that you're treating them first, but it's good business practice for the business to lead that way because it does all the things we just talked about, lifetime value, et cetera. So
we want to get to the last bucket within this three. We've done owned, we've done managed. take us home, RJ. What's the last one?
Yeah. So the last bucket is leveraged, and these are assets and channels that brands can leverage or can influence. I'm sorry. So again, going back to like the news is one of those in this one, or influencer in affiliates. You can provide them with context, with information through your own assets. Maybe you can help to tell the story, but ultimately, if we were to engage with you as an influencer, you're going to do it through the lens of your brand, and you're going to tailor it to what your audience expects of you. Because if you don't, they're going to start looking at you and saying, well, why is he so off brand? Why is he doing this differently? So that's where the brands who engage with the influencers sacrifice some degree of control, because they're ultimately leaving it up to you to do it in your words and your way. So again, the reach is there, right? And the eyeballs and the ability to get the message out to further people. But in doing that, you sacrifice control. That's not to say that brands shouldn't do this. It's just to say that they should understand first how the leveraged tier plays with the managed tier, plays with the owned tier, and how the owned bucket really is the one that is, that's the soil that all these plants are drawing from.
Some must-do activities in the leveraged bucket, because I can imagine people saying, well, Glenn and RJ, we don't control those, so they're just going to do what they do. But imagine you'd have something to say about, well, wait a second. You should at the very least be listening in on those channels.
Yeah, totally. Right? I mean, for sure, you need to listen, because you need to, there are things you can do to preempt. If you know a negative news cycle is coming, you can do things to kind of get out in front of that.
Okay.
You can minimize that from the jump by having a solid owned foundation. But listening in provides you with awareness of what's coming, what's happening. And it kind of works as a two-way street, because when you see these reviews, or when you listen to word of mouth and can kind of engage with your audience that way, when it's a little more honest, a little more unfiltered, because they don't feel like they've got to appease the brand. They're just talking amongst friends almost in some of these communities.
Sure.
You can draw back from that. Well, geez, maybe this is really what our customer base feels like and what they're interested in. And then you can tailor owned assets to either satisfy or object to or respond to some of those concerns in a way that is befitting of your brand, but that allows the customer to feel heard and still capitalizes on that tier that's just beyond your control.
Right. So one of the pieces, though, that we might have to influence them with, it comes back to our content, I think, is, wouldn't you agree that particularly if we're in a new space, new vertical, or we're trying to do a completely new twist on an old, that we need to give our customers words that they can use to explain the satisfied state that they're in, because they're trying to describe the world that you've now taken them into, but a world that is completely foreign to people who haven't yet bought from you. Mm-hmm. Right. So I'm thinking, I mean, Apple comes to mind because they've done this so well so many times. But when they brought in the iPhone, they had to condition people to talking about what an app is and how using this marketplace of different things that I'm putting on the hard drive of my device and then getting an experience out of, like, that's hard unless you have the words. And I'm sure that there was a lot of work done inside of Apple to come up with those words so that that category could be described by the people who'd touched it, tried it, felt it, and loved it. Do you think that we ought to be doing something there when we are explaining what it is we have so that influencers can pick up the ball and run with it?
Yes. And I think, like, that's where the influence comes from, the influence portion of the tier, where if you're partnering with an influencer, or if you're working, if you're trying to influence the content that's being created by others at that level, you can provide your own content that reinforces that information that, again, you're hoping that you're drawing from, right? So a news story about your brand or about your product, you're hoping is drawing from something that you've put out. And when you've put it out, you've introduced some of that language. And like there's a challenge, right? Because when you think about like I think it's often overused, but it applies here, Henry Ford. And if he had left it up to the consumers, he would have just gotten a faster horse, right?
Yep.
And so some of it is, and Steve Jobs is a great example of giving people what they didn't know they needed.
Yeah.
And so there's an element of introducing new ideas that require a different application. And that's what I think is great about the Mach 6 is that you can tailor it to what you're trying to do. So, we're trying to introduce these new ideas, reception marketing, owned asset optimization, the Mach 6, and that requires engaging on podcasts to reach a different audience and have more time to articulate the concepts and the ideas. And hopefully I'm doing a good enough job articulating. You never really know, but to repetitively kind of say it, right? The 7 touch points. When there's new ideas, it might take 100 touch points, or it might take it said in this way, or a video versus audio, all of these different things. And so that's where, having enough of the material in an owned asset capacity and then finding ways to distribute it so that you are kind of guiding that jargon and that lexicon of nomenclature. The brands want to stay in control of that as much as they can, but they do have to relinquish some to others, or else you're never going to get other people to hear about it or think about it.
Yes. So first off, thank you for putting yourself through a little clinic right there. Love it.
You're not my therapist, in case you didn't
right.
know it.
But the other one is for any marketers who are hearing this that may not feel empowered to do this, they actually have a superpower here. And this goes very far in a organization that makes a technical product. I'm thinking of like software or some piece of hardware that's highly engineered, or even an engineered service where, could be lawyers, could be accountants, tax auditors. These arenas are made by people who spend all day around each other. Great. But they are the last people that you want to find who will be able to describe what the experience that their transformative technology or service does. You want to talk to the customers. You as marketers want to codify those emotions and future states. And you actually can go back into those product groups and say to them, here's how we think it should be talked about. And when I've seen this at work, most times they welcome the help.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not only outward to the customer, but inside to the technicians. They're like, oh, is that what we do? Cool. That's great. We're going to now bake that into our documentation. We're going to start using it more when we're on stage to speak about this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think having the challenge for marketers is to have every unique individual that you want to connect with understand your product or service in a way that's meaningful to them. And it's hard when you're trying to do a one-to-many type of a promotion where you only get one television commercial to articulate that message. How do you get it to resonate? But I think the internal team and the internal group, having them have a firm understanding of how everything plays together and how it doesn't and how it shouldn't is critical. And that's where you get buy-in and support at the root level, so that when you are talking to customers, they see the continuity, or it doesn't confuse them, because it's reflected in the product, it's reflected in the messaging, it's reflected in the support that you get on the customer service
all
side.
the way.
Yeah. And I mean, it's hard because marketing quickly becomes disjointed.
Well, it is hard, and something I know you'll agree with is when people are looking at all the work that's involved here, it might behoove them to look at someone outside to come in and assist them with it. So on that note, if people want to know more about owned asset optimization and how the company that you're with takes it, where would you send them?
So there's quite a bit of content and material that can be found at terakeet.com, TERAKEET. And we have a blog, we have a resource center, and currently, because this is a new concept, a new idea, this is really the only place that you can find owned asset optimization information. So there's a lot of good resources there. And then of course we're on all the social media channels as well, posting additional information and content.
And if people want to find you, where would they go?
The best place to find me is on LinkedIn, RJ Licata. I think there's no fancy numbers or anything after it, just that. So that's the best place to find me. I'm pretty active there, posting about OAO and interacting with other marketing related content.
Thanks again, RJ, for giving people this way that they can look at how they're doing their marketing and make it even better.
Thanks for listening. Follow the show on Twitter at Funnel Reboot. If you like what you have heard today, please consider leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts.